Hi, this is Rick Levine with what's supposed to be the mid-month update for September of 2019, but I think I need to rename it to three-quarter month update, or perhaps we'll just call it the autumnal equinox update for those of us in the northern hemisphere. Um, Normally these are middle of the month, but somehow the month got away from me. And so I want to focus on a couple of things today because we will have the October update coming out by the 1st of October, and that'll be in just a week. Um, so I do want to cover the rest of September from now until the end. But I'd really like to focus in a bit on something that I would normally just spend a few minutes talking about, and that is the autumnal equinox, actually, the equinoxes in general, because today, the day I am recording this on September 23rd, early this morning at 12:50 a.m. in the morning here in Seattle. That would be 3:50 a.m. in New York. Adjust your time zones accordingly. We had the sun's ingress into Libra, and when the sun changes into a cardinal sign, whether it's Aries, Cancer, Libra, or Capricorn, these are the four turning points of the year, the four seasonal markers. And when the sun moves into Aries, that is the beginning of spring. Again, in the northern hemisphere, it's reversed in the southern hemisphere. From Earth's point of view, when the sun ingresses or moves into Cancer, that's the beginning of summer. When the sun moves into Libra, as it did very early this morning, that's the beginning of autumn. That's why this is the autumnal equinox. And when it moves into Capricorn, that is the beginning of winter, again in the northern hemisphere. And the thing of interest is that there really are only 2 days a year when when the earth is in quote unquote harmony, when daylight and darkness are in fact equal. But as we'll discover in just a moment, the the nocturnal night, the equinites, um, the spring equal night and the autumn equal night are not exactly equality of darkness and lightness. Um, the fact is that the autumn equinox and the spring equinox are exactly halfway between the two solstices. And the solstices, we think of the earth moving around the sun, and because of the tilt of the earth, the sun looks like it moves up and down. In the summer in the northern hemisphere, the sun is higher in the sky, and in the winter in the northern hemisphere, the sun creeps more toward the horizon. In very, very, very far north, the sun doesn't even come up over the horizon in the winter time, and nor does it go below the horizon in midsummer. But the fact is that we astrologers track the sun going around the zodiac. Even though it's the earth moving around the sun, we track the sun going around the zodiac, and that's longitudinal movement. But the sun also moves north to south in the sky, and that's how high or low its declination is in the sky. And the solstices mark the turning points of the sun moving further to the north, or at least appearing that way in the north, so that by the midsummer, the sun is as high in the sky as it gets. And that's the summer solstice, because the sun, the sol, has to become stitial. It stands still. And then it begins 6 months of it moving downward to the winter solstice, where it stands still again, and this up and down movement of the sun is corresponding to its movement around the zodiac. Now, the equinoxes, the autumn and the spring, autumn equinox and the vernal equinox, or the spring and the fall and the spring, mark the halfway points between the solstices. But the deal is that even though the word means equal night, the sun actually is above the horizon, or let's say it this way, there is more daylight than there is lack of daylight or darkness. And this doesn't matter where you are on Earth. It's on the equinox, there's more light than dark. And its reason is kind of strange and interesting, and it's something that we don't normally think about. But since we're focusing on the solstice, I'd like us to think about it for a moment. And there's basically two reasons. The first reason is that the atmosphere actually bends, it refracts the rays of the sun, so that when the sun is below the horizon, it's coming through the atmosphere and it actually looks like it's already risen. And so the point of the matter is that it looks like the sun is above the horizon when it's already tipped beneath the horizon. Secondly, is how we measure how we define the sunrise and the sunset. And of course, the sun doesn't rise nor does it set. Bucky Fuller suggested that we called it sun sight in the morning and sun clips in the evening, because the sun is eclipsed by the surface of the earth, because the sun doesn't rise, it's the earth spinning around that brings the sun into sight, and then it eclipses it from the horizon. But basically, the sun is a big disk. And so when it begins to tip above the horizon, that's when we begin to measure the daytime. And on the other side, when it's going beneath the horizon, there's parts of the sun already beneath the horizon, but it's not until the last piece tips beneath the horizon that we define the actual moment of sunset. So the point is that we add a few moments to the day, one, because of its visual appearance, and two, because of the size of the sun. Now, it turns out that there is something called equilux, which is different than equinox or equinox. The equinox is what the equinoxes are what we celebrate, but there's actually about, depending upon how far north of the equator you are, there's anywhere from, oh, I don't know, 5 to 8 minutes of more light than darkness in a day. And it turns out that a few days after the autumn equinox, depending on where you are, it's about September 26th, that the sunrise and the sunset are exactly 12 hours apart. And it's interesting because we normally think of as the equinoxes as the days when day and nighttime is equal, but it's really a few days off. Now, having gone through maybe more than you wanted to think about this, let's take a look at the chart for this particular equinox, because the chart itself is of interest. And of course, when we look at a chart, the first thing we see is that at the moment of the equinox, the sun is at 0 degrees Libra 00 minutes, because if it was just a minute earlier, the sun would have still been in Virgo. This is the moment of the equinox. Now, I'm running this with a 0 degrees Aries rising, known as a natural horoscope, so that the houses conform to the signs. The first house is Aries, the second house is the second sign, Taurus, the third house is the third house, Gemini, and so on. Because depending upon where you are on the planet, the horizon is going to be different. And so we're just looking at this from a standpoint of the zodiac, and there's no implied horizon here. But there are a few things that are of interest, because the equinoxes and solstices, in a way, set the tone for the season ahead. And so what we have here is the sun moving into Libra, but there's no real aspects. There's no Ptolemaic aspects directly to the sun, unless we count the sun's opposition to Chiron, which certainly is an aspect. But many people would not use that because Chiron is not necessarily considered to be one of the visible planets, nor the three additional outer planets. But I am marking it here because I think it's significant, especially since Chiron seems to be playing such an important role right now in hopefully what may be the combination of the wounding or rewounding and healing of the planet. But we do have the sun at the beginning of the autumn season in the north opposite Chiron. More importantly, though, I think is the fact that the moon in Cancer is conjunct the north node, while Saturn in Capricorn is just minutes of arc away from the south node. And you can see how close this is. We're looking at a moon opposition to Saturn. And granted, Pluto is in the picture. Remember, Saturn has just turned direct. Pluto will turn direct next week, or about a week and a half. And when it does, Saturn will catch up to Pluto. And of course, that exact Saturn-Pluto conjunction will occur in January, coming up January of 2020. But right now, for this chart, we want to mostly focus on the fact that the moon is opposed Saturn, and they are both square Venus and Mercury. Granted, they are also square the sun by sign and Chiron by sign. But when we're looking at the exact degree spreads here, it is way more close. It's more closely aligned to the fact that we have the moon opposition Saturn and square Mercury, with Venus kind of right nearby. And I think this speaks a little bit to the issue of the obstacles and the structures, Saturn, that we are running up against, and that Mercury in Libra can see both sides of the equation, because that's what Libra is. And in fact, with the autumnal equinox and the sun moving into Libra, Libra is the first sign in the zodiac that has an implied opposite. Granted, Aries is, I'm sorry, the sign opposite Aries is Libra, the sign opposite Taurus is Scorpio, and so on. But Aries through Virgo are the first 6 signs, and it's not until we get to the 7th sign, Libra, that we've already defined a sign that's opposite. And as Aries is I, me, mine, itself, Aries is the unity, because the baby knows no universe separate from the self. With Aries, it is said that there is no self, not self difference, because everything is self. When the sun moves into Libra, however, this is the first inkling that there is a subject-object differentiation. This is the first oppositional sign, and it is the sign of relationships. As such, Libra is considered to be the sign of relationships, whether we're talking about intimate relationships or family relationships or work relationships, or relationships amongst friends, or simply the relationship you have with a book. Anything from the inside to the outside is a relationship. Wherever you have opposites, be they male, female, good, evil, yin, yang, up, down, in, out, whatever set of opposites you might have, those opposites are defined by the polarity between Aries and Libra. And as such, since Libra is also the only sign in the zodiac that's not represented by an animate or living creature. Remember, zodiac comes from the Greek word zoidion, which means a zoo. It's a menagerie that was alive, except for Libra, because Libra is simply the scale that has a focal point. And the focal point is the balance point. Libra is not the sign of balance. It's the sign of seeking balance. And so with Libra, we always have a focal point. And in our chart, we have the sun opposite Chiron as the basic focal point of Aries to Libra, Aries being self and Libra being the other. It is said that in traditional or in astrology that the seventh house is the sign of the partner, but it's also the sign of the open enemy because it's any opposition, it's any opposite. I think of William Blake's proverb from the marriage of heaven and hell, where he says opposition is true friendship. It's that idea of the give and take and the interaction that's implied with Libra. But here we have Mercury and Venus and the Sun in Libra. Mercury in Libra can see both sides of any equation. Remember the word equation coming from the same root as equinox. Equa means the same as, and an equation means that this and that are the same. And with Mercury in Libra, the ability is to see both sides of an issue. Now, with Venus in Libra, it's even to like both sides of an issue. The problem here, though, is that the issue that we're looking at is the differentiation of the nurturing Cancerian moon, the moon in her domicile, the moon close to her own node. This is a very powerful moon that's about home and family and security. It's about the security of even nationalism and isolation. Remember, the United States of America is a Cancer sun sign, born on the 4th of July. But that moon in Cancer connected to the North Node, the karmic North Node, as to where we're going, the purpose of the soul. We're being restricted, and we may even be flipping back into what Freud would call infantile regression, because the South Node in its directionality of time is often considered where we're coming from as opposed to where we're going to. And with Saturn strong in its domicile, remember the moon is at home in Cancer and Saturn is at home in Capricorn. These planets are both very strong right now, and Saturn in conservative and self-restrained Capricorn is lined up with the south node of the moon, which is what we've already done well, and it holds on to the past. This is the strict fundamentalism that we might be seeing as a backlash to the whiplash that we're getting as we're thrust into the future these days, with Mercury and Venus mediating in the middle here. Now, one other point about this chart, granted, there's a couple of quincunxes, one between Mercury and Neptune, which might be a little bit confusing, the other between the moon and Jupiter, which might make it a bit difficult to know really how far to extend the hope, the big ideas. But I think that behind that, we have this square from Jupiter to Mercury, from Jupiter to Neptune. And this square was exact just a few days ago on Saturday, the 21st. And this was the third and final Jupiter-Neptune square of 2019. This square began back in January, and in some ways has been the bugaboo, the fly in the ointment, or one of them, of this year 2019, because of the difficulty in which we've had in describing reality from fantasy. Remember, Jupiter is the big idea, but Jupiter is always restrained by the reality of Saturn. In fact, Jupiter and Saturn, to my way of thinking, are really the same planet. It's just that, Jupiter and Neptune are in fact the same planet. It's just, and the square is between Jupiter and Neptune, not Jupiter and Saturn. So the square between Jupiter and Neptune, Jupiter is restrained by Saturn, but Neptune is like Jupiter that's escaped from Saturn, because Jupiter and Neptune are both expansive. And yet Jupiter can only expand within the constraints of Saturn. Neptune has no limitations. It's not only expansive, it's diffusive. It's like a gas that will continue out to infinity. It's the imagination rather than the philosophical logic of Jupiter. But in the square, this has presented problems throughout the year, and those problems are not quite done, although the aspect itself, the exactness of the aspect, has in fact just passed a couple of days ago. The other piece of this seasonal chart, this chart for the autumn equinox, is not just this powerful T-square with the nodal axis and the moon and Saturn and even Pluto in the picture squaring Venus and Mercury, but the other point here is that Neptune, part of that Jupiter-Neptune square, Neptune, part of the quincunx from the kind of awkwardness of the dreams and the imagination off of the logic of the Libra, the fair play, the trying to find objective fairness of the Mercury and Venus in Libra. That Neptune is at a point in this T-square, the opposition, the tension. This is a tug of war between nurturing, caring, security-seeking Cancer moon, intense opposition to stabilizing Saturn, wanting to hold on to the status quo, maybe even revert to the past or some illusion of what greatness might have been in the past. And yet Neptune here is forming a sextile and a trine to this opposition. So you can see this opposition has a square on one side to Mercury and Venus, creating that T-square. But on the other side, that Neptune is at a point that some people refer to as the point of Thales, Thles, it may be Thales, a Greek philosopher. I'm not sure why it's called that, but and I don't know a whole lot about him as a character, but I do know that this point is a point of releasing the tension. It's sextile Saturn and even falls in the middle, close to the midpoint of the Saturn-Pluto midpoint, but it's right in there. Jupiter is sextile it from one side, and from the other side, it's very closely trine the moon. And so those dreams and those illusions and that hope, whether it's real hope or false hope, is kind of built up into this chart. So enough there. We should also just quickly mention, though, that we do have Mars lingering back in Virgo, even though the other planets, the sun, the other inner planets, the Sun, Venus, and Mercury, have already moved into Libra. Mars does not move into Libra until October 4th. And so we'll talk more about that in the forecast for the month of October next week. So let's look at the chart between now and the end of the month. We are now looking at a chart for September 23rd, and this is a chart for noon today, on the day of the equinox, but the equinox has already passed. We can see here that the sun is almost a half a degree, 0 degrees and 27 minutes into Libra at noon today. And we're going to follow this. This is an animated chart now, so we're going to follow this chart as we move through the rest of the month to get a sense of what's going on this month. The other thing that is significant in the chart for today, for the 23rd, aside from the fact that the sun has just moved into Libra, is the fact that the moon is moving in Cancer. And by the end of the day, actually by early tomorrow morning, if we jump this ahead just one day, the moon moves into Leo. The moon actually moves into Leo. These are all New York times that I'm going to give you, at 5:19 a.m. and that is New York time, East Coast time. The moon moves into Leo. And this is for Tuesday, September 24th. But the real key to the day, to Tuesday, is the fact that Mercury is in the highlight, because Mercury reaches a point where it makes an exact sextile to Jupiter, 17 degrees to 17 degrees. And earlier in the day, Mercury, which is moving rather quickly now, almost 2 degrees a day, earlier in the day, Mercury would have made an exact quincunx to Neptune. We talked a little bit about this quincunx when we looked at the solstice, at the equinox chart, but this is a slippery truth teller, that Mercury in Libra wants to be fair, but it's going to expand, it's going to exaggerate, it's going to excess in putting on the flourishes, and it's going to do that in a way that accentuates this Jupiter Neptune square, which was exact just a few days ago, but it's still within about a half a degree of orb. And so it's going to be difficult to discern the truth this week. And I think this will linger with us a few days, especially since Venus by Friday will slide into that same degree. And it's almost like Mercury is there first and then Venus. And then next month, next month, the sun will come through that same point. So we have this kind of problem with really knowing what's going on and what the truth is. I mean, not that we don't at other times, but it seems like right now that's even exaggerated a bit more. By the 25th, we have Venus moving into an exact square with Saturn. I'm going to take the aspects of the moon off just because they're a bit much. They get in the way. Okay, I've taken the aspects off the moon. Obviously, the lunar aspects are important, but they come and go so quickly that they get in the way of the other aspects that will hold, and I want to talk about them. I'll still mention some of the lunar aspects, but we won't be overwhelmed by the number of lines in this picture. So we're looking now at the chart for midday, and that's midday from Redmond, from Seattle's perspective. We're looking at the chart for midday on Wednesday, and midday on Wednesday, actually 3:19 p.m. New York time, that would be 12:19 Seattle time. We have Venus at 13 degrees 56 minutes, making an exact square with Saturn, which actually is at 13:57. If we move this ahead 15 minutes of Earth time, that would be an exact square. And so we're going from yesterday, Tuesday, which was a mercurial day. Today, we kind of run into a wall where the Mercury stuff is still active, but it's beginning to settle. And as Venus comes into that square of Saturn, something doesn't feel right. It's almost like we may be isolated. We may feel isolated. We may wonder if relationships are even worth all the effort because something isn't right, something is difficult to explain, someone's not seeing us as we are, we're not seeing someone as they are, there can be a bit of a disagreement. But in some ways, this is just a speed bump that's reminding us to slow down emotionally, if you will, to reassess our values, and to reconsider what is important without just barreling ahead like sometimes we can do. And that is on Wednesday, the 25th. On Thursday, the moon moves into Virgo. And Virgo is a mercurial sign. Gemini and Virgo are Mercury's two signs. We have Mercury in Libra, actually Venus at home in Libra, Venus moving closer to its quincunx with Neptune that I just mentioned before. That'll be exact tomorrow, or actually on Friday. And yet what we have now is we have Venus making a square to Pluto. So what's interesting is, because even though Saturn and Pluto are kind of in this wide conjunction, the planets one at a time are coming and making aspects first to Saturn and then to Pluto. Mercury squared Saturn a few days ago and is now squaring Pluto. Venus is now, or it just squared Saturn yesterday. In a few days, it will square Pluto. And at the same time, each of these are coming through the quincunx to Neptune. So what does this mean? Individually, we can break down each aspect. We can talk about the Mercury square Pluto. Someone in power may be abusing, describing what's objective. That the idea of fair play in communication, that Mercury in Libra is bumping into something which is kind of changing the rules as it goes, because that's often what Pluto does. Saturn is the rules, and Pluto is the perspective that maybe the rules are more like habits, and over time they change. This is the evolutionary piece. And so we have that Mercury squaring Pluto, perhaps creating some difficulty in communicating, and difficulty in either saying what we mean or having it really understood at a deep level. At the same time, we have the sun forming an opposition to Chiron, and this is very powerful. This kind of flavor was in play back at the equinox, back at the equinox on Monday, but now it's exact today, and there's this idea that Chiron is not only the wounded healer, as many people refer to it, and correctly, Chiron was a wounded healer who was granted immortality, and yet had a critical wound. And so there's almost this idea of Chiron projecting and wanting to salve his own pain in everyone else. But there's another piece about Chiron that's very significant, because Chiron is a maverick. Chiron doesn't fit the mold. Chiron's a centaur. It's half animal and half horse, half human. Chiron cuts inside the orbit of Saturn, where it is sensible. Inside the orbit of Saturn is the three-dimensional world, but then Chiron goes out past the orbit of Saturn and out toward the orbit and out to the orbit of Uranus. And so Chiron has this kind of thing that lives in both worlds. And when the sun opposes Chiron, not only might we find ourselves in situations reminiscent of old hurts or wounds that come up now, but we also may find ourselves breaking free. This is the overreactive of, the phrase of cutting off the nose to spite the face. There's a rebellious maverick piece here that is absolutely willing to do anything to break loose from the bargain, from the pain, from the commitment. And the sun opposition to Chiron is very interesting, because what it really is demanding is that it demands us to not only forgive others, and that just doesn't mean letting them off the hook. It really means forgiveness, so that we not only are forgiving them of the deeds that they may have done, but we're also releasing ourselves from holding on to the pains and hurts of the past, so that we can attack the present anew. And so this is an important piece of this whole deal on Thursday, the 26th. By the time we move to the 27th, we have, first of all, the moon, as it's moving through Capricorn, will pick up on trines to both Saturn. Well, actually, it'll pick up on trines originally to Uranus, that was exact yesterday afternoon, yesterday meaning Thursday, and then we'll pick up on trines to Saturn early Friday morning, and to Pluto mid-afternoon. Again, these are all United States times, continental, New York times is really what I'm talking here now. Even though the chart says Redmond, it doesn't matter. The fact is, though, that the moon, as it's moving through Virgo, is also heading towards Mars. And that exact conjunction of moon and Mars is Friday night, again, Eastern time, just a few minutes before midnight. That'll mean 9 p.m. here in Seattle. But there's a bit of anger that can be expressed. There's a bit of direction. There's a bit of intensity. Yes, it's late at night. Some people may already be sleeping, but we might find ourselves on a second boost of energy on Friday night from that moon closing into Mars. And maybe we also may see in the news some unnecessary fighting words, or some acts of assertion or aggression. Obviously, unfortunately, these days we don't need to wait for the moon to hit Mars for that to happen. It seems to be part of what's going on, but some of that may actually become a bit louder here as we approach the weekend. The other piece in here, as I alluded to earlier, is that Venus is now moving into that quincunx position with Neptune. And here we may be a little bit confused now about what we like or what we want. We may have thought that we knew what a solution was to a question or a problem, but maybe yesterday's square of Mercury to Pluto brought up some stuff that maybe created some uncertainty, and maybe today we might be floundering a little bit and not quite as sure of what's going on. We also have the sun moving into a quincunx with Uranus, because that becomes a very, very important part of tomorrow. I say tomorrow, Saturday's new moon, because once that moon clears Mars and then moves into Libra, which it will do very early tomorrow morning. And let's actually move this an hour at a time now so that we can see that moon gaining on Mars. And there it is, 9 p.m. Pacific time, midnight Eastern time. And then we continue to move that along, and there the moon moves right there from Virgo into Libra, and that is 4 a.m. Pacific time, and about 7 a.m. It's actually 6 a.m. and a little bit earlier than that. Here, let's back this a little bit. It's actually, if we did this just a minute at a time here, boom, 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 there it is right there. We'll go now back to the hour. So there, the moon right there moves into Libra, and that's just it's 3:03 a.m., which means that the moon moves into Libra at 6:03, 6:02, 6:03 a.m. In New York. And all of a sudden, we see this cluster of stuff in Libra. We're still waiting for Mars to hit Libra, which it will. But now we're moving toward the dark of the moon. We can really feel the pressure of this building. We also have Venus today making a, let's see, Venus making a sextile with Jupiter. It made its quincunx with Neptune yesterday. And on Saturday, the day of the new moon, Venus sextiles Jupiter. There are some things that are feeling better. Venus Jupiter is a sweet aspect, but it doesn't automatically cancel out all this other stuff. But it certainly is indicative of a day when we can find some sweetness in indulgence and pleasure and being outside in nature, hanging out with people we love, doing things, eating at a nice restaurant. These are all Venus Jupiter kind of things. It's certainly a day when we can inadvertently spend too much money, but we're coming toward that. We're in the dark of the moon, and the actual Libra new moon occurs at 2:26 p.m. Eastern time, which would be 11:26. And we'll back this up now a minute at a time so we can get this exact. Move this forward, and there it is right there. So at 11:26 to 11:27, you can see how the moon changes from being before the sun to catching up with it and moving afterwards. Now we're going to go back to the hour at a time. And so the actual new moon itself in Libra, the new moon in Libra is at 2:26 p.m. Eastern time, 11:26 a.m. Pacific time. And we have something else that is very, very important. It's not exact until early tomorrow morning, but it's close enough that this becomes, I think, the singular most important thing about this new moon, aside from the fact that it is a new moon in Libra, and we have four planets altogether in Libra, including Venus, the relationship planet at home in Libra. This is planting seeds in relationship. This is finding fair-mindedness, finding equanimity, and getting pleasure, Venus out of Jupiter, Venus-Jupiter sextile, exact today also, getting pleasure out of relationships, and yet there's a sliver in our foot as we're walking, and that sliver in the foot, the mosquito in the tent, if you will, is the new moon being so closely quincunx to Uranus, In fact, the moon reaches the quincunx to Uranus a half an hour after the new moon. The new moon is Eastern time at 2:26 p.m., and the moon reaches the quincunx to Uranus at 3:05, just a half an hour later. And this is awkward. This is this is an annoyance, but it's not a minor annoyance. It's a major, significant annoyance, because all that fair-minded, all that fair playing, all that sense of balance and harmony and equanimity in relationships, all the efforts that we're making for the indulgence of the pleasure and the finding the fun, and the nice things, getting values that work and having them morally and philosophically, working, all these things here in Libra are all coming back down to the fact that not only is Venus quincunx Neptune, which was exact prior to the new moon, but this quincunx to Uranus in Taurus is basically saying something's got to give, something's got to explode, something's got to change. This is the awakening of a stubborn, bullheaded perspective that doesn't want to change. And we can project this out onto a nation, a political enemy. We can project this out onto someone else. But the key here is, especially because we're coming off of this moon opposition to Chiron, which would have been exact just a few hours prior to the new moon, and the sun's opposition to Chiron, which would have been exact yesterday, or 2 days ago on Thursday. The fact of the matter is that we can point our finger at someone else, we can say it's them, but we all have that Uranus and Taurus part of us that doesn't want to awaken because we're too comfortable where we are. As I said this, I was reminded, of of Greta saying at the climate change conference earlier today, I mean, the house is burning. This is not about saying what you want to do or what you're planning on doing. It's uncomfortable how much change needs to occur and how fast it needs to occur. And in a way, this new moon, and I'm not saying the new moon is about her or specifically about, climate change, climate justice, climate crisis, whatever you want to call it. But I am saying that feeding into this, that's the energy of what this describes. This isn't, even though Mars is still in Virgo, and Mars in Virgo wants to change things little by little by little, because sometimes the most subtle, the littlest in homeopathy, the tiniest amount of correction can change everything. That's great. But right now, we're at a stage where we know what needs to be done. This new moon is aware of what the tipping point is, and Uranus and Taurus isn't going to go easily. What's the solution to that? Well, I think it resides in each and every one of us, of having the courage to look inside and to see what it is that needs to change, rather than projecting everything out onto someone else that needs to make those changes. Time moves on, and we're going to go back here to moving this a day at a time, and we now move to Sunday, and on Sunday the 29th, we now have the exact quincunx that actually occurs in the morning. So this is all weekend. We can feel that we can feel what isn't right, even though we're getting a buzz as the moon is moving through Libra. The moon lines up with Venus late on Saturday night. The moon lines up with Mercury. I'm sorry. The moon lines up with Venus early this morning, and lines up with Mercury tonight. That's Sunday. When I say refer to today, I'm always referring to what the date is here in the chart. But what that means is that the moon also forms a sextile with Jupiter, and that sextile to Jupiter is sweet. It doesn't last long, but it's there. And at the same time, that moon is also moving through squares to the nodal axis, Saturn and Pluto. Sunday is a complicated day. We also have, and I don't have these drawn in, but we also have an exact quintile that's 1/5 of a circle between the sun and Jupiter. And this is a 72-degree aspect. And this sun Jupiter quintile is really powerful because it gives us the ability to manifest, to create out of our imagination something into the real world that happens through the idea, Jupiter being manifest. This is an upbeat aspect, and it sits behind whatever the difficulties are by the moon's squares to Saturn early this morning and square to Pluto in the afternoon, and its conjunction to Mercury. This is a noisy day, and yet we have some really good energy feeding behind it if we can make the most of that energy, if we can figure out a way to express it. And then we have early tomorrow morning on Monday. We see the chart here has changed to Monday. We have the moon moving into Scorpio. The moon moves into Scorpio at 5:41 a.m. Eastern time, and then it opposes Uranus on Monday by mid-afternoon, 3 o'clock Eastern time. That moon is opposed Uranus. It's the proverbial expect the unexpected, which is always the astrologer's strange line, as if that's a real prediction. But, you know, crazy stuff happens. Things happen that are unexpected when Uranus is opposed by anything. And certainly here, the moon, even though it doesn't last long, can certainly lean into some changes that we experience on Monday afternoon. And then we move into October, and we're not going to touch a whole lot here on October because we'll cover this beginning in the monthly update that will be out by October 1st. But we also have Venus. Remember, I'm cleaning this up because I said that Mercury and Venus, and then later in October, followed by the Sun and Mars, each of these planets will square Saturn, will quincunx Neptune, will sextile Jupiter, and then will square Pluto. And what we have on October 1st is Venus, which has already squared Saturn and already sextile Jupiter and already quincunxed Neptune, then sextile Jupiter. On October 1st, Venus squares Pluto, and this again is a bit of a toughie. It's not an impossible aspect to deal with or to manage, but one needs to have the courage to look at change, to look at transformation, to reassess what one values, both in a moral and ethical sense, and also even in a financial and a fiscal sense. That Venus square Pluto can, in fact, require us to do some deep digging and to perhaps deal with some things that may be a bit uncomfortable. Now, what's particularly interesting about this Venus square Pluto is we know that an astrological rule is, in theory, it's a rule. The slower moving the planet, the stronger its energy. In other words, a moon transit only lasts for an hour or a few, and the moon moves rapidly, as opposed to a Saturn transit, which is much more serious because Saturn moves so much slower. Well, Pluto, of the normal regular used planets, moves the slowest. And yet Pluto right now has been retrograde, and it is slowing down, and it turns direct on October 3rd. Now, if we move this ahead a day at a time, we will see that Pluto is at 20 degrees 38 minutes here on September 30th. On the 1st, that's the exact early in the morning, the Venus square Pluto early in the morning. Pluto is still at 20 degrees 38 minutes. We move it again, Pluto is still at 28 degrees 38 minutes. And we move it again on October 3rd, it's still at 28:38. And now, even though it's technically direct, because it moves direct on the 3rd, it's still at 2038. In fact, it takes another several days until October 8th or 9th before Pluto even moves 1 minute. Now, why am I mentioning all of that? It's because as we come to the end of September and we have the moon, well, at first we have Mercury making its square to Pluto at 20 degrees 39 minutes. And Pluto's still retrograde, but Pluto barely moves a minute from 2039, where Mercury is square it on Thursday, the 26th, to the day the moon squares it on Sunday. It's at 20 degrees 38 minutes. And then Venus squares it um, at 28 degrees, I'm sorry, 20 degrees and 38 minutes. It's earlier that morning. Um, and so this Venus square Pluto is kind of the last of the inner planets hitting Pluto until the sun gets there. But by the time the sun gets there, almost 2 weeks down the road, Pluto will have already begun to move direct, and so the energy will be different. This is a real power play right here, and there's stuff going on that makes this very extraordinary. And I think in some ways, this is all feeding into what will become the Saturn-Pluto conjunction as Saturn begins to pick up speed and gain on Pluto, and the two of them finally conjunct at about 23 degrees of Capricorn in January. That's it. Once again, I'm going to apologize for not having this out mid-month. Sometimes these things are just a bit overwhelming, and I just couldn't quite get it together to do it. So thank you for your indulgence. As always, I do appreciate you guys. I appreciate that you do have flexibility over me getting these things out. And I will see you shortly with the update or with the forecast for the month of October. Until then, may the stars be with you. Think cosmically, act locally, and have a useful, beneficial new moon, and plant some seeds of intention. I'm Rick Levine.